Ever noticed how power never announces when it changes sides? It doesn't hold a press conference or issue a decree. It just drifts quietly until the hands that once protected the people begin protecting themselves. That's how capture begins. Not with gunfire, not with headlines, but with small invisible trades of conscience. A favor here, a silence there. And before anyone realizes it, justice starts working night shifts for those who can afford its time. Power is a strange thing. It begins as service, it ends as appetite. The longer it is held, the more it hungers for itself. Have you ever wondered why those who start as reformers so often end as defenders of the very systems they swore to change? Because power whispers. It tells you you're essential. It convinces you that bending a rule today will let you fix the system tomorrow, but tomorrow never comes for the corrupted. Captured power wears many disguises. Sometimes it looks like loyalty. Sometimes it hides behind competence. It keeps everything functioning. Budgets balanced, protocols followed, so no one suspects the moral current underneath is flowing backwards. That's the genius of corruption. It learns to mimic order. Ever noticed how people speak in meetings when power is present? The air tightens, voices soften. Suddenly the truth starts wearing polite clothing. Everyone agrees too quickly, smiles too easily, and the room begins to suffocate under the weight of diplomacy. That is the sound of capture, a silence too comfortable to be honest. Captured institutions don't collapse. They perform. They hold inquiries, issue reports, stage the appearance of accountability. But if you listen closely, you can hear the performance in the applause. Hollow, rehearsed, the echo of a nation pretending not to know. It doesn't happen overnight. Capture begins as convenience. Someone powerful bends a rule for efficiency. Someone else signs off to keep stability. And soon, conscience becomes red tape, something to be worked around instead of worked with. By the time the alarm bells ring, the thieves already have the keys. There's a phrase people use in politics: align yourself with power. But what they forget is, when you align too long with power, you inherit its blindness. You stop seeing people and start seeing positions. You stop hearing cries and start measuring risks. And just like that, the servant becomes the master's shadow. Ever noticed how fear always follows power around? It's loyal. Fear sits quietly in the back seat of every decision and whispering, don't lose this. Don't upset them. Don't speak out. Fear is how power keeps its servants obedient. It promises protection while tightening the leash. But here's the irony. The moment you stop fearing power, its spell breaks. Because power has no strength of its own, only the energy you give it through obedience. Captured power is clever. It recruits language, words like procedure, confidentiality, and national interest become shields against scrutiny. The vocabulary of virtue turns into camouflage for vice. That's why so many people feel confused. They sense the wrongness but can't name it. They're told everything is under review, as if justice were a file waiting for a stamp. Have you ever watched how captured power reacts to exposure? At first it mocks the messenger, then it questions their timing, then it promises reform. But reform without repentance is theater. The cast changes, the script remains. Real reform requires surrender, a return to humility, a willingness to admit that authority without accountability is just corruption wearing a medal. Captured power thrives on distance. The higher it climbs, the less it listens. Decisions made in boardrooms ripple into streets. but the noise never travels back up. That's how injustice becomes invisible. Those who create it never have to live in it. But distance is an illusion. Eventually, everything collapses inward. The walls of comfort can't hold back the echo of what's been ignored. Sometimes I wonder, what would happen if those in power truly looked at themselves? Not through reports or advisors, but in the quiet mirror of conscience? Would they recognize who they've become? Or would they, like so many before them, mistake authority for identity? That's the tragedy of capture. You forget who you were before the throne. Power without principle becomes theater without truth. Everyone keeps acting, hoping the curtain never falls, but eventually it does. And when it does, the audience realizes the heroes were villains, and the villains were just following orders. That's how history humbles us. Ever noticed how ordinary people start mirroring the system they live under? When leadership lies, citizens learn to survive by pretending. When justice can be bought, morality becomes optional. Captured power doesn't just corrupt officers, it trains minds. It teaches generations that compromises wisdom and that silence is safety. And then we wonder why courage feels extinct. But power isn't evil by design. It's energy, neutral, potent, dangerous when left unchecked. What determines its nature is the consciousness that wields it. Give power to love and it builds nations. Give power to fear and it devours them. So perhaps the question is not who has power, but what spirit moves through it. Every generation inherits the task of cleansing power, sometimes through protest, sometimes through truth commissions, sometimes through the quiet integrity of those who simply refuse to play along. The work is slow, often thankless, but every act of honesty reclaims a piece of freedom that capture had stolen. Ever wondered why truth always seems to chase power like a shadow? Because power cannot exist without it. It borrows legitimacy from truth, even as it hides from it. That's why truth is never destroyed, only delayed. It waits patiently behind the noise of control, knowing that every empire built on deceit eventually runs out of stories to tell. Captured power fears witnesses. That's why whistleblowers are hunted, why journalists are threatened, why ordinary citizens are told to mind their own business, because tyranny begins the day people stop watching. The antidote is awareness, not outrage, not gossip, awareness. The simple act of paying attention is enough to make corruption nervous. And still, there are those within the system who remember why they joined in the first place, not for status but for service. They are the quiet rebels, not loud enough to make headlines, but firm enough to hold the line when everyone else looks away. They may seem powerless, but they are the true custodians of a nation's soul. Have you ever thought about how fragile authority really is? It depends on belief. Our collective agreement that someone deserves to lead. Once that belief dissolves, titles lose meaning. The crown turns into costume. That's why captured power fights transparency so fiercely. The moment people see clearly, they stop obeying blindly. Every act of accountability is a small resurrection. It brings a dead principle back to life. It reminds us that justice is not a relic, it's a relationship between power and conscience. When that relationship breaks, we get tyranny. When it heals, we get freedom. Ever noticed how power speaks in plural? We, our, us. But truth always begins in singular. I saw. I know. I cannot pretend. That's how capture unravels. Through one person reclaiming their voice. It doesn't take a revolution, it takes recognition. Captured power may seem unstoppable, but it carries within itself the seed of its own collapse. Pride. Pride blinds, humility restores. And sooner or later, every system intoxicated by its own control meets the sobriety of consequence. Perhaps this is what history keeps teaching, that no matter how deep the capture, there will always rise a generation unwilling to inherit the lie. They will question what their parents accepted. They will speak where others stayed silent, and in doing so, they will remind the world that authority belongs to integrity, not hierarchy. Ever wondered what liberation really means? It's not toppling governments or rewriting laws. It's freeing the collective conscience from the belief that corruption is inevitable. Liberation begins in the unseen. In the moment an individual decides to stop serving power and start serving truth. So when we talk about captured power, we are not talking only about politicians or police or judges. We are talking about the capture of the human spirit, the surrender of responsibility in exchange for comfort. Because every time we look away, we sign another invisible contract with control. And every time we tell the truth, we tear one up. Power is not the problem. Forgetting the purpose of power is. Power was meant to protect, not possess, to build, not brand, to guard justice, not gatekeep it. And when it remembers this, it becomes sacred again. So let the captured be confronted. Let truth walk uninvited into the boardrooms and offices where conscience was last seen. Let every oath remember its origin, because a title without integrity is just an empty nameplate, and a nation without accountability is just geography pretending to be destiny. Captured power is not forever. It ends the moment awareness returns. It ends when people stop clapping for their own oppression. It ends when the fear of losing power is replaced by the desire to use it rightly. And in that ending, there is hope. Because every collapse of corruption is also the birth of clarity. Every exposure is an invitation to begin again, wiser, cleaner, freer. A moment of reflection. When power remembers its purpose, it stops being a throne and becomes a trust. And trust, once restored, is the truest form of strength.